Yes, there is. Talking to us from there. So is that Scott? Greetings, Scott. Hi. Good morning.
Good morning. Or good afternoon.
Good afternoon to the rest of us, the world, and welcome to our seminar for today. So we have a stellar cast because it's all over the universe. But we begin with Bebbington, who is not a stranger to us here. Some will recall the Pittsburgh lectures a few years ago. Which year it was? 1999. This is a few years ago. Forget that I've been here this long myself. So a few of us, as I say, will remember that. Most of you have come since then. But it's also an honorary fellow of MWRC. We're busy right now for weeks. And so we have the opportunity to hear something of what's going on right now. So the title appears on a piece of paper here. Yeah. The Mid-Victorian Revolution in Wesleyan Home Mission. Over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. Let me say first of all that I'm very grateful for the Visiting Research Fellowship awarded jointly by this college and the John Rylands Institute, which I've been exploiting mercilessly since July. I very much enjoyed it. Some superlative material on the Shetland Islands in the Methodist Archives, which I've been digging into 5 books worth. Pure heaven. Some of the bundles of papers never untied since 1877 when they were deposited. So that's pure pleasure. Now, the paper that I'm going to give today is based on the research that I've done during that time as Visiting Research Fellow, and it's much broader than the Shetland Islands, which in some ways I regret, but I hope it provides a framework for the sort of work I'm doing on Wesleyan, more broadly Methodist missions in the British Isles in the Victorian period. So as has been said, my title is The Mid-Victorian Revolution in Wesleyan Home Mission. The prevailing view of Victorian Methodism is unfavourable. Wesleyan Methodism, the second largest Protestant denomination in the United Kingdom, is thought to have played its part in the weakening of Christianity. Methodism on the received narrative remained down to around 1840 a vigorous movement, gathering in the working people of industrialising Britain. From that point, however, its onward progress in its predominant Wesleyan form was arrested by the rise of respectability, the dominance of rich laymen, and the authoritarianism of its leadership under Jabez Bunting. The book that did most to establish this perspective was Kenneth Ingall's Churches and the Working Classes in Victorian England, 1963. Ingalls argued that as cities burgeoned in the later 19th century, all the churches failed to adopt an effective way of reaching the mass of the population. But he took the Wesleyans as a prime example of a denomination that succumbed to the onset of secularization. 20 years later, in the history of the Methodist Church in Great Britain, Henry Rack, though offering some qualifications, accepted the broad lines of English interpretation. Figures that he cited seem to confirm the analysis by showing that although membership was rising in the Victorian era, population growth was outstripping it. Whereas in 1851, the proportion of the population in Wesleyan membership was 1.4%, by 1901, it had dropped to 1.2%. More recently, however, historians have shown that secularization made far smaller inroads in the society of the later 19th century than had previously been supposed. In particular, Callum Brown is contended that British values were shaped by evangelical Christianity throughout the 19th century and long afterwards. Far from being largely absent from worship, as Ingalls proposed, the working classes flocked to church in the mid-Victorian years. Brown, who alludes to the work of Clive Field on Methodism, has pointed out that the working classes formed the majority of most Victorian congregations. The pessimism of Ingalls appears exaggerated or even misplaced. It is generally acknowledged that a more optimistic estimate of the success of the churches is in order. The home missionary strategy of the Wesleyans calls for reassessment in the light of this fresh perspective on the effectiveness of the churches. Was Wesleyan Methodism adaptable during the years from the 1850s to around 1880? Ingalls supposed that the broad answer was no. He contended that the structure of circuits and itinerancy inherited from John Wesley was tenaciously retained, even though it was unsuited to the increasingly urban world of the period after mid-century. The circuit system, giving each Wesleyan minister responsibility for many chapels, meant that he entered most pulpits only rarely. The itinerancy dictated that ministers in each circuit changed after only 3 years, or even more frequently. Hence, there was little bonding between minister and people. In the 1880s, however, Ingalls points out the forward movement in Wesleyanism grappled with the problem, calling for the erection in cities of central halls led by ministers who would address the social issues of the day. Crucially, the ministers were to appear regularly on the same platform and to hold long-term appointments, so breaking with the circuit and itinerancy principles. Christopher Alston Moore has confirmed that Hugh Price Hughes, the leader of the forward movement, expounded a novel vision of a Methodist church with national responsibilities, so fostering a revolution in his denomination's methods. Hughes, never short on bombast, described the foundation of his own London mission as probably the most significant and important event in the modern history of Methodism. Consequently, the mid-Victorian period before Hughes is generally perceived as lacking in innovation. Ingalls does mention Charles Prest, the secretary of the committee responsible for home mission at this time, but claims that his techniques were not original, not successful, not large-scale, not designed for urban society, and poorly financed. In short, Prest's work was not pioneering and merely a token gesture. Roger Standing, in his recent book on the forward movement, is similarly dismissive of Prest. That estimate is not universally held. By contrast, John Munsey Turner has written that Prest was a pioneer. Yet there is a widespread sense that nothing much altered in Wesleyanism between Bunting and Hughes. Here, the aim is to examine Prest's era more carefully, and so to explore whether Turner is right to diverge from Ingalls. Was there a revolution in Wesleyan home mission before the 1880s? Certainly, a major precipitant of change was constituted by the Wesleyan reform crisis of 1849 to 1852. Discontent with the domineering policies of Jabez Bunting and his circle found expression from 1844 onwards in the anonymous fly sheets. And when in 1849 Bunting demanded that all ministers should sign a declaration denouncing the campaign of criticism, 3 of the alleged ringleaders were expelled. The result was an outburst of popular denunciation claiming that the rights of true-born Englishmen were being denied. In order to enforce reform, the radicals raised the cry of "Stop the supplies," refusing payment of their dues. Obtaining no redress, they hemorrhaged out of the Wesleyan body during the early 1850s, the majority eventually emerging as the United Methodist Free Churches in 1857. During the 5 years at the peak of the reform crisis, Wesleyan membership fell by some 100,000. That's out of some 300,000 to start. Because circuits were expected to raise the bulk of the salaries of their ministers, a declining membership meant that many of them could afford to pay only lower sums and to employ only a smaller ministerial staff. Wesleyan ministers had the depressing experience of seeing congregations shrink and of having too little money for the support of their families, and too few colleagues for the pastoring of their flocks. Morale in the ministry plummeted. The loss of income to the parent denomination was catastrophic. The spring of 1853 was estimated by the conference in the sum of the four main funds of the denomination would altogether be in debt by as much as £39,000. Our connectional funds, one member of the finance subcommittee told the fellow minister in April, are in a sad plight. This was required. For the short term, on the recommendation of the subcommittee, a relief and extension fund was launched, eventually raising over £82,000. But for the longer term, a more drastic rearrangement was called for. In 1853, the contingent fund, which existed to supplement circuit funds by, for example, topping up ministerial salaries, received far less than it collected in 1846. It was Charles Prest who saw the way forward most clearly. It was essential to lift the morale of ministers by increasing the income of those who were helped by the contingent fund and assisting paying circuits to pay extra ministers. To do that, however, more money was required. The raising of funds had to be yoked to the evangelistic imperative, which was at the core of Methodism. If a fund could be branded so as to show that it was designed to spread the gospel, it might attract more and larger donations. As discussions continued during 1854 to 1856, Prest set out that vision in a series of letters in the denominational newspaper, The Watchman. He showed how many parts of the country could benefit from an injection of fresh manpower. As a result, in 1856, the contingent fund became the Home Mission and Contingent Fund. With Prest as secretary, a full-time post from 1857, he became responsible not just for supporting existing survey work, but for carrying the gospel into fresh places. The financial emergency precipitated by the reform crisis led to the creation of a major new agency promoting domestic church growth. A second reason for the emergence of this institution, however, was the report on the religious census of 1851. In that year, there took place the only official census of churchgoers ever conducted in the United Kingdom. Census officials required returns from every place of worship, specifying the numbers present at each service. Because many people attended more than once, the figures obscure the totals of individual worshippers, but historians have recalculated the results so as to produce estimates of the actual numbers of attenders. The Wesleyans, according to the best appraisal, attracted some 924,000 people in England, which represented 5.46% of the population. Overall, the proportion of the population at church was approximately 39%. While those statistics might today be considered extraordinarily good, at the time, when it was expected that all would be in church unless unavoidably absent, the numbers were thought appalling. The official report published 3 years later highlighted that members of the working classes were usually among the absentees. The myriads of our labouring population, remarked the writer of the report, are as ignorant as were the Saxons on Augustine's landing. Prest was evidently much impressed by these findings. In the first annual report of the Home Mission and Contingent Fund in 1856, he quoted a sentence about the Saxons to support his contention that indifference to the claims and blessings of Christianity is the crying evil of our times. In his letters on Home Mission in the Watchman, he reissued extracts from census returns on public worship. The census evidently moulded Prest's way of thinking about the challenge of the unchurched. The Home Mission and Contingent Fund was his solution to the problem unearthed by the religious census. A third motive for the creation of the fund was a desire to emulate the work already undertaken by other denominations. In the decade when evangelical ascendancy in national life was more marked than before or since, cooperation with like-minded believers seemed natural. The agents of the Home Mission declared Prest in 1860 were pursuing their work without unholy rivalry and in cordial cooperation with the evangelical activities of other Christians. Accordingly, the exertions of the interdenominational London City Mission seemed exemplary. the existing home missionary societies of the Independents and Baptists, the efforts of the Church of Scotland, and the policies of the Free Church of Scotland were all worthy of imitation. Only the primitive Methodists, who were said to have a few fluctuating societies, none of them considerable, in areas where Wesleyan home mission was called for, did not warrant being copied. Above all, the Church of England had set a good example. At a time when Archbishop Sumner and Lord Shaftesbury, evangelicals both, dominated the councils of the Church, its growing efforts to provide for the nation spiritually commanded great respect. Prest quoted J.C. Miller, the evangelical rector of St. Martin's, Birmingham, in a letter to the Watchman. Equally, he cited with approval the Church Pastoral Aid Society, an evangelical body, and even the Additional Curate Society, a high church equivalent. Wesleyan Methodists ought not to fall behind. Methodism, too, wrote Prest in his first annual report, occupies by the providence of God a position of usefulness, of influence in the country, that cannot be overlooked or despised. The denomination must show us it was just as capable as the others, including the established church, of vigorous, organised evangelism. The home mission venture was launched both because other denominations set a good example and because Wesleyans did not wish to be left behind. The example of foreign missions was a fourth reason for the establishment of Prest's home mission. Wesleyan Methodist Missionary Society, begun rather tentatively in 1813, had proved hugely successful in raising money. By 1846, contributions of foreign missions reached £94,000, nearly 10 times the sum donated to the contingent fund. And though the reform crisis sapped this enterprise like every other way, the generosity of donors. It is a plain duty, he wrote, to use our best exertions for the conversion of the heathen abroad. May such exertions be Mission Society. Annual public meetings with star preachers from other circles. Public meetings were duly held to enlist sympathies for the conversion of home heathenism. Although the domestic version never attained the popularity of the overseas missionary meetings, they were an indication that home missions planned to imitate the accomplishments of the foreign courts. The consequence of these factors, the reform crisis, the census report, the example of others, and the precedent of foreign work, was the setting up, under the auspices of the Home Mission and Contingent Fund, of a new category of home missionary ministers. Special regulations to govern their activities were drawn up in 1858. Fundamental principle was that such men were not to be absorbed in the regular working of the circuits. They were assigned separate districts and required not to deputise from ordinary circuit ministers. Each, according to the regulations, must give himself wholly to his distinctive and proper work. His calling was essentially to visit from home to home, taking care to go to every house to which he can gain access until all have been visited. He should initiate spiritual conversation, distribute tracts, encourage school attendance, invite to special religious services, which should be extemporised and informal. He must keep a careful journal, such as was required of overseas missionaries, and complete an annual report. The circuit was normally to share the cost roughly evenly with the central fund. At first, the ministers employed in this work were young unmarried men, But from 1862, the preference was for older men with families. There were other changes. By 1876, the missionary reported that since he was responsible for a church of over 180 members, pastoral visitation took up a great deal of his time. Clearly, he had been absorbed into the regular life of the circuit far more than had been envisaged at the start of the scheme. The following year, as explained that in Horncastle, Lincolnshire, the town was too small to create separate mission districts, and so the work of the Home Missionary Minister is to a great extent unavoidably blended with that of the other circuit ministers. Over time, then, the missionaries became less distinct. But they did prove a success. Numbers grew from an initial 4 in 1857 to 33 by 1860 and 83 by 1865. That point shortage of money dictated a decrease, but from 1882 and 1872, numbers again expanded to 106 in 1875. By 1863, the amount the committee was paying missionaries had risen to become almost as high as the amount it spent on helping poor circuits. It was generally agreed that the home missionaries did provide the shock troops for the aggressive evangelism the age required. How much of a novelty did they represent? In several respects, it has to be said the pattern was traditional. Certainly in the Mid-Victorian development, there was no change in theology equivalent to the emergence of the social gospel in the forward movement. Normal evangelical priorities were emphasized. Regulations required that each missionary should introduce as much of the scriptures as possible in conversation and engage in the simple and faithful preaching of Christ crucified. They were to show zeal for the salvation of their perishing countrymen, and their very existence was testimony to the need for relentless activity. They therefore displayed the four qualities that had been seen as the hallmarks of evangelicalism: biblicism, crucicentrism, conversionism, and activism. We want no new schools for this work, declared the 1861 annual report. We want nothing but the old paths of our fathers. We want nothing but the old gospel. Samuel Waddy, governor of Wesley College, Sheffield, a close friend of Prest, a member of the Committee of Management of the Home Mission from 1862, used to tell his family that the first principle of Methodism was that the gospel is the only and all-sufficient means divinely appointed for ensuring the welfare of mankind. The Home Missionaries entirely concurred in that view. There was no element of innovation in the theology they professed. Likewise, the Home Missionary Scheme did not challenge the existing organisation of Wesleyan Methodism. In the wake of the Reform controversies, there was no question of introducing significant institutional change. It's not surprising, therefore, that the new system slotted carefully into the current structures. Regulations specified that the home missionaries were to be subordinate to the superintendent ministers of their circuits, and the work, in common with our other proceedings in circuits, will be under the supervision of the district committees. The enterprise must avoid the risk of interfering with or contravening any of the principles of our providentially formed and well-tried discipline. Hence, the missionaries, for all their distinctive work, were not to have a separate status. To set them apart would be fraught with evil consequences to the unity of our body and to the harm and efficiency of its action. Accordingly, Prest was always scrupulous to call his agents not home missionaries, but home missionary ministers. They were men no different from their peers in ordinary circuit work. From 1862 onwards, furthermore, the aim of the missionary ministers was to create so effective a system of evangelism that their districts could be incorporated in the general work of the circuit. Local home missionary arrangements, that is to say, should eventually blend entirely into the existing structures. There was no intention of institutional revolution. Yet, there were also marked novelties in the Mid-Victorian home missionary programme. For one thing, it paid full attention to urban Britain. Efforts were lavished on London in particular. Capital had not been a denominational strong point, the Methodists at the 1851 census having only a small proportion, 8.1% of church attenders there, by comparison, for instance, with a high figure, 41.9% for Leeds. Accordingly, from the start of the home mission, the largest district financial allocation was to London. In 1871, 14 out of 78 home missionaries were deployed in the capital. A parallel scheme focusing on buildings rather than preachers ran from 1861. This highly successful venture, initiated by William Arthur, was the Metropolitan Chapel Building Fund. Repeatedly, and especially after in 1866, policy changed to allow funding of chapels seating fewer than 1,000. Places where home missionaries served had buildings erected by the Metropolitan Fund. Although there were rural requests for home missionaries, Press report on the Home Mission for 1861 commented, the most urgent demand is from the metropolis. The most energetic efforts at this time were made by Alexander Macaulay, later Charles Prest's successor as Secretary of the Home Mission and Contingent Fund, who from 1858 to 1861 was stationed in Poplar. At the end of his term, he requested to be located in the adjacent area over the metropolitan boundary, in Bow and Plastone Marsh, where the expansion of the London docks had suddenly created a vast population. He became superintendent of a new home missionary circuit, the 12th London, and within 2 years established 10 classes. By 1868, the Bow Road Chapel was an extraordinary beehive of activity. There were a Sunday school, a day school, a home missionary society, and a juvenile home and foreign missionary society. There were also a Bible woman, a domestic mission, a mothers' meeting, a maternal society, a Dorcas society, a tract society, a Sabbath school for adults, Sabbath Bible classes for young men and young women, a young men's association, a home and foreign missionary library, a congregational library, a school library, a penny bank, and a ragged school in course of protection. Here, long before the forward movement, was a range of facilities similar, not identical because of the different circumstances of the time, to those that movement was to advocate. Social as well as the religious needs of outcast London were being addressed. In other urban areas, there was extensive home missionary outreach. 9 of the 16 appointments in 1859, for example, were to town or city circuits. Expanding towns on the coast were discussed by the Home Missionary Committee and then catered for by a special watering places fund that was proposed by William Morley Puncheon and largely financed through his oratorical efforts. The urban enterprise that turned out to be most significant, however, was in Liverpool. There, a chapel in Pitt Street near the city centre was chosen as the base of operations for a home missionary minister in 1861. The missionary managed to organise cottage prayer meetings, Sunday evening services, and open-air preaching that attracted a multitude of sailors. Sunday school flourished, a penny bank opened, and tract distribution went ahead. In March 1862, there were 86 members on trial, an indication of evangelistic effectiveness. The success, however, did not endure. By 1874, the missionary then had become despondent. The neighbourhood has greatly deteriorated, he reported. Congregations are small and the surrounding wickedness great. In the following year, that decay provided the opportunity to turn Pitt Street into a mission of a more elaborate type. Its creator was Charles Garrett, an immensely popular minister who began a mission locally funded and staffed by lay people in Manchester in 1872, just before leaving for Liverpool, where he served under Alexander Macaulay in the Cranmer Chapel circuit. Two men may well have plotted together a new approach, but the precipitating factor was the Liverpool mission by the American revivalists Dwight L. Moody and Ira D. Sankey in 1875. Garrett, a keen temperance reformer, outlined a scheme for establishing a series of cocoa taverns to keep Liverpudlians off the bottle. Moody persuaded the wealthy Presbyterian merchant who sponsored his campaign, Alexander Balfour, to endorse the scheme, and Balfour insisted that Garrett should remain long-term in Liverpool to manage it, thus breaking the itinerancy principle. Garrett was put in charge of Pitt Street, which was financed by Balfour and his friends as the Liverpool Mission, and set about establishing not only cocoa taverns, which eventually there were over 70 in the one city, but also lay-led mission halls scattered about the area. Garrett remained until 1899, setting a precedent for some of the features of the forward movement, though not its characteristic central halls. The innovative Liverpool mission as has not previously been noticed, emerged from the wider home mission movement. There was a significant change in the role of women in home mission at this period. They remained active as class leaders, though rarely having men under their leadership. It has been shown that a few Wesleyan women continued to preach after mid-century. There was a marked upward trend in the proportion of Sunday school teachers who were female. The titans of work with children, such as Hannah Frost at Lincoln Fields Wesleyan Methodist Sunday School in Leeds, teacher of a senior class and leader of the Meeting for Mothers of Scholars, tended to be women. But the most drastic alteration in the role of women was in their appointment as deaconesses. The initiative being taken in the Church of England by William Pennyfather, an evangelical clergyman, who in 1860 opened a training home for women workers that was in 1864 transferred to his new parish of Mildmay Park in North London. Wearing special uniforms, they undertook nursing and social care, as well as house-to-house visitation. That was the inspiration for the employment of similar deaconesses by the Metropolitan Methodist Lay Mission, founded in 1871 by a group including T.B. Smithers, an energetic editor of a variety of Christian journals, and from 1870, a member of the Wesleyan Home Mission Committee. Wary of criticism that the venture was aping Catholic sisterhoods, the Metropolitan Mission insisted that it used the term deaconesses because it was scriptural, Protestant, simple and descriptive. Thomas Bowman Stevenson, who was a minister in Bolton and had a deaconess serve in his church in 1868, determined to use more women in that capacity in the children's home he founded in London in the following year. By 1875, he had 2 deaconesses on the staff as matrons and was training 7 more young women alongside young men. From 1878 or 1879 onwards, they were called Sisters of the Children, and some were engaged in evangelistic work as well as care for the young. These developments were not officially sponsored by the Home Mission Committee, which Stevenson joined only in 1878. Eventually, in 1890, Stevenson was to establish a Wesley Deaconess Order that became the established avenue for women's ministry within the denomination. Long before that, however, some Wesleyan women were playing a part in Christian service with an unprecedented degree of formal recognition. Children also became involved in home mission activities, though as supporters rather than as agents. Money raising for home mission changed drastically during the period. At its opening, the practice was normally to hold an annual collection each July to complement subscriptions from wealthier members. Prest fostered additional public meetings with visiting speakers, and that did increase the sums raised, though if Leeds Brunswick was typical, only marginally. There in 1863, a mere £11, a total of £72 raised for the Home Missionary Contingent Fund came from the public meeting, even though the speaker was calling. The revolution in giving came when Circuit adopted what was called the Blake system. Joseph Blake, a draper of Harrow, set about training the children of his neighbourhood to collect systematically for overseas mission. His juvenile associations were officially adopted by the Connection in 1841 and widely publicised through Blake's booklet, snappily entitled "The Day of Small Things" or "Incitement to Juvenile Activity and Usefulness, founded on practical effort in connection with Christian missions," 1849. At first, as the title suggests, the associations were concerned solely with overseas mission. The second edition in 1865 was issued as a guide to the formation of children's groups that would support home as well as foreign work. Mission at home standardly received half the amounts collected. In 1861-62, only 27 associations contributed to the fund. By 1870-71, 268 did so, and the number continued to grow. The spirit of competition roused children, usually organised through Sunday schools, to prodigious efforts. In Milford Haven in 1883, for instance, Annie L. Thomas won an illuminated card for collecting the biggest sum during the year, £2, 2 shillings and 6pence. Louis Carter received a book for making the largest number of payments to the secretary during the year, 43. The money raised by the juvenile associations often exceeded the combined sums from all other methods of collection. Children became the mainstay of home missionary finance. as an ingenious way of slipstreaming the huge success of Sunday schools of the period. Another innovation was the setting up of chaplaincy services for the armed forces. Religious provision for the army was essentially Anglican, though special arrangements were made for Scottish Presbyterians and separate facilities were tolerated for Roman Catholics. Charles Prest, whose natural spirit, according to his biographer, was martial, threw himself into demanding equal treatment for Wesleyans. The start of his time as Secretary of the Home Mission Contingent Fund coincided with the creation in the aftermath of the Crimean War of a vast military training camp at Aldershot. On the 10th of July 1857, a new Wesleyan iron chapel was opened close to the cavalry barracks, even before they were occupied. William Harris Rule, a redoubtable senior minister with experience from the 1830s of 9 years' service in Gibraltar, was appointed the superintendent under the auspices of the Home Missionary Committee. As in Gibraltar, at this time with the backing of Prest, Rule demanded the right of Wesleyan soldiers to follow their own consciences. It cannot be right, wrote Prest, that they should be marched to the Anglican or Scottish churches, and even to the Romish Mass, as not unfrequently happened, while the Queen's regulations promise every soldier that he shall be at perfect liberty to worship Almighty God according to the forms of his own religion. There ensued a protracted struggle against dogged resistance from the local chaplains and the chaplain general, entailing correspondence with the War Office, conflict over who should conduct burials, access to hospitals for Wesleyan ministers, and much else. Eventually, in 1862, the government announced that there would be a category in the armed services of other Protestants, which conceded the central principle which Rule and Prest had fought. By 1873, the Wesleyans were maintaining 11 chaplains for the Army and Navy in the British Isles. The battle against the ancient prejudices and customs of the army, as Prest put it, had important implications. To demand equal treatment for Wesleyan soldiers was to oppose Anglican exclusiveness. That meant claiming the status of a national faith, something that has been seen as distinctive to Hugh Price Hughes's later vision of Methodism. Such an idea, however, was already there in Prest's mind. The new stance also meant turning away from Bunting's alignment of Methodism as a sympathetic partner of the Church of England. The Home Mission policy on military chaplaincy made Methodism more a challenger of the established Church than its coadjutor. Rural mission was as much a part of Prest's agenda as its urban counterpart. That was an entirely reasonable stance in the 1850s and 60s because the population of the countryside was still growing. Rural depopulation became a significant process only from the 1870s, though subsequently it gathered impetus. Prest addressed the relative claims of town and countryside in his report for 1859. Home Mission ministers were in demand from the large towns where work might make the most favourable impression. But not all effort should be channeled that way. Methodism, Prest continued, by its organisation and working, is well adapted not only to pervade the masses, but especially the scattered portions of our population. To have confined this renewed missionary effort altogether or principally to the large towns would have been a departure from the successful precedents of our history. The itinerancy, that is to say, could reach where other church systems could not. Accordingly, 3 appointments will be made to towns and 3 to country areas. Some rural circuits, after all, were in desperate need. Kington in Herefordshire, for instance, was reportedly feebler in 1856 than it had been 20 years earlier. Because there were too few ministers, visits to the remote parts of a large area were infrequent. Although some urged the opening of ministry in the market town of Bishop's Castle, it was 27 miles from the circuit centre, though to launch work there would be hopeless. It was to cater for such circumstances that the committee made grants for rural missionaries. The Home Missionary Committee, however, did not simply accept the existing itinerancy system. In 1865, Prest began a sustained critique of the existing methods of rural ministry. Ministers were habitually stationed in towns, making forays into the countryside to preach. Whereas in the past they would have gone on a round, staying for a few days in the villages and undertaking visitation, it increasingly adopted the practice of returning home immediately after preaching in a village chapel. They were not getting to know the people. Occasional irradiation for a few hours from a central town, Prest concluded, was a discredited policy. The remedy, he believed at first, was forming groups of villagers into rural circuits with resident ministers. 1870's friend, Frederick Johnson, who had served on the Home Missionary Committee of Management from its inception, wrote a pamphlet calling for fresh ventures along these lines. The committee resolved in the following year in favour of additional rural ministers, village circuits, and a few ministers to concentrate on areas where Methodism was absent or languishing. It was the last proposal that became permanent when the 1875 conference the first time appointed missionaries. These men travelled around the circuits holding weekday mission services, effectively becoming the denomination-responsive equivalent of the period's growing band of semi-professional evangelists. Although that was far from Prest's original idea, it was a significant addition to Wesleyan polity. It prepared the ground for a fresh category of denominational agents, the connectional evangelists, who were championed by Macaulay when he succeeded Prest. Connectional evangelists were travelling preachers who held revival missions in any part of the country. Macaulay had conference approved the principle in 1880. 2 years later, they first appointed Thomas Cook, who was soon joined by Thomas Moore and Edward Davidson. The three connectional evangelists were to gain a national, and in the case of Cook, an international reputation as winners of souls. Here was another development that, though it partially merged into the forward movement, was begun well before that venture was conceived. The home missionary strategy of Wesleyan Methodism during the Mid-Victorian years, then, proved more adaptable than has been supposed. The reform crisis and the report on the religious census precipitated a new approach. The examples of others engaged in home mission and advocates of foreign mission helped mould it. Home missionary ministers appointed from 1856 embraced no new theology and did not challenge existing institutional structures, so there were important elements of continuity with what went before. Yet Charles Prest and his appointees promoted work in London and Liverpool that anticipated the methods of the later forward movement. Women began to serve as deaconesses, and children were recruited as funders. Chaplaincy to the armed forces sprang up, and rural itinerancy was subjected to a critique that led to the appointment of district missionaries and connectional evangelists. This reformation helped ensure that Wesleyan Methodism returned after its mid-century catastrophe to a state of healthy vigour. Its vibrancy during this period is attested by the statistics. The Wesleyans, Michael Watts has concluded, held on to their share of the rising population down to 1880, only going into decline after that date. The denomination was successfully growing in the years before the forward movement took off in the mid-1880s. Hugh Price Hughes trumpeted the advances of that epoch, but there's a great deal of more discreet change in the earlier period. Mid-Victorian Wesleyan Methodism experienced a quiet revolution in home mission.
We have some time for discussion.
Thanks very much, David. Can I ask you a few questions about funding?
One at a time.
You discussed funding at some length, and I found that particularly interesting, because it still seems to be one of the unexplored areas of modern British church history. Do you have a sense yet of who the givers are? And is there a kind of culture of anonymity where giving is concerned? So, I mean, if there are annual reports that list givers, for example, is it possible to work out who givers are? And are gifts for home mission, do they tend to be large one-off gifts or regular giving? I mean, you mentioned the juvenile collection, but with other kind of forms of giving, is it kind of larger gifts or regular gifts?
Right. I agree that the subject of financing of mission is neglected. However, there is a superb study of the financing of overseas mission during the Victorian period by Brian Stanley. It's his PhD, but it's never been published. That is extraordinarily illuminating because it looks at methods to raise money, but also the way in which giving corresponded to the rise and fall of economic cycles, and how different foreign missionary societies operated in parallel in terms of their financial giving. An extraordinarily illuminating study. In a sense, half the work has been done, but nobody knows about it. Home mission, however, has not been studied. So one of the many paragraphs chopped out for delivery was about one of the other ways in which there was continuity between this period and the BC period. That was heavy reliance on rich patrons. Very substantial sums were given by big men. Thomas Farmer of Hammersmith, for example, who was a pal of Jabez Bunting, was extraordinarily rich. He retired when he was about 40 from his family business, and he spent his whole time engaging in philanthropy, big supporter of British Foreign Bible Society and many other organisations. Well, he was somebody who helped set up this mission fund in the first place. He was on the conference subcommittee that organised it. Perhaps the most important figure is Sir Francis Lissett of Highbury, a glove maker who was Sheriff of London in 1866 and received a knighthood the following year. And he was the person who actually provided most of the funding for the Metropolitan Chapel Building Fund. These people, however, were not anonymous. You asked about anonymity. They certainly were very keen for people to know what their right hand was doing. They not only had their precise sums of money listed in annual reports, they also were invited to lay foundation stones and open chapels, and it was always laid on with a very thick trowel who had given the money for this building there. They were very, very much prominent figures within the denomination, in the sense, stars equivalent to the preachers. And sometimes they were very good at public speaking on these occasions, but relatively rarely though. And that's how the preachers managed to maintain their ascendancy. Nevertheless, these people did have a major influence on policy, not least in home mission. The extent to which one-off substantial gifts were balanced by the pennies of the poor varies from time to time and from place to place. In London, undoubtedly, it's big gifts from prosperous London businessmen that are the biggest source. But if you go to some other parts of the country, much smaller contributions come in abundance, and that's true in small market towns as heads of rural circuits. In Lincolnshire, for example, that would be true. So that varies very much spatially, I think, to say. However, home mission could have done very little without the Sir Francis Lissets of this world.
So does that help explain why Methodists and others end up with so many buildings that are problematic in the medium term? Because they're given by a donor but don't actually have the basis for continuing to exist?
It's got a good deal to do with it, in that these people did actually specify a good deal of what the building should be like, as well as where they should go. But normally they were very hard-headed people. They were businessmen. And they actually looked at the placing and the scale of the buildings that they funded with a businessman's eye. And therefore they catered both for current needs and for expected needs in the near future with urban growth. However, unfortunately, when we're talking about the 50s, 60s, 70s of the 19th century, London was still only a tiny spot on the map by comparison to what it became by the First World War. The expansion of suburbs was huge from the 1870s, in fact, because of the internal railway network, which allowed working class people for the first time to live on the perimeter and to go in by train to work. so that these men, however far-sighted, could not cater for the mushrooming of London in particular, but also big cities like Manchester over the next 50 years. And therefore, a very large number of the big chapels of Methodism were very near the centre. Other people did not live near the centre. So apart from those that turned to the central halls, which was a recipe for dealing with part of this problem, there was a great deal of redundant plant in the inner city. And that has remained so, and still is in some measure so, in the 21st century.
One of the issues to do with that is that local congregations, the church council are the managing trustees of the building, and so they have to approve the closure of any building because they are the people who worship in that building. Very rarely do they want to close it. So there isn't any central ability to influence those decisions. And just on the children collecting, it's interesting, it still continues. So I think it still continues now, but growing up in Methodist Church, we would collect JMA, Junior Missionary Association, and we'd go around with a little book and we'd harangue everybody in the congregation to give us money. So it was very much small scale, but it grew, and at the end of the year, a medal or a bar to the medal was given. If you'd already got a medal, to sort of recognise the amount that was collected, and it was announced, who collected the most from Wesley. So that continues.
And it is significant. I perhaps didn't stress this enough in answering an earlier question. That the children actually contributed most of the money by the end of this period. They were very, very effective, and you can imagine the children that I referred to going around and pestering, just as you did. And it's very hard to turn down a small child who asks for a sixpence. Very hard, as I have found with a small daughter. Communications in the past. And so they were hugely successful. And let it be noted that the phenomenon became the mainstay of home mission in this period. Not before, not after, this period. And is one of the chief symptoms of what I would call a revolution.
Saying a wee bit more about Manchester, just following this period. You mentioned Liverpool. Was there anything happening specifically in Manchester at that time, or was Liverpool much more dominant? I'm slightly fuzzy on this.
No. Manchester actually developed a lay mission even before Liverpool. And that's because Charles Garrett, the man who was eventually drafted into taking over the Liverpool mission in 1875, had previously been in Manchester in 1872. And at the end of his 3 years there, which was 1872, he saw the need for involving lay people in active paid mission work. Another change in this period, which again is in one of the paragraphs that I chopped, was that lay people actually started to be paid as mission agents. And Manchester was in the forefront of that process. I suspect, although I haven't actually demonstrated it yet, that it was following the example of London. I know Manchester would not wish that to be so, because London is what Manchester has done before. But I think in this case, probably the idea of that man T.B. Smithies I mentioned. It was a very creative name. Or should be paid, because he was very keen on getting people and all sorts of other activities. Manchester 1872, which was within a year of its starting, and that lay mission was pioneering and was perceived to be so over a long period. It wasn't as prestigious as what happened in Liverpool. It was pioneering. Alden Street.
I think Salford, Manchester is slightly after that. Is that more Methodist, or is that also?
I'm sorry, I don't know.
Okay, there's a quasi connection here. So.
City mission, was it?
Would it be with City mission related?
Could be under.
Yeah, okay. Right.
Could be very likely to be up there, I think. Oh, yes. But Manchester being so big, and having so many rich people in the late 19th century, was the creative centre of mission they need, no doubt.
I was really interested to talk about the home missionary ministers, and that one of their roles was to lead extemporary services. Is that
Yeah.
Probably a bit more than the Wesleyans, or is that not the case? the extemporary worship.
Well, primitives were different from Wesleyans, there is no doubt about that, in that they were exuberant and noisy all the time. However, Wesleyans were exuberant and noisy a great deal of the time. And a very high proportion of the Wesleyan members and adherents were exactly the same social groups, exactly the same type of people, exactly the same sort of emotional temperament as those whom the primitives drew in. Now, I am equally interested in primitives, but I think in order to simplify our understanding of 19th century Methodist developments, a lot of historians have said Wesleyans were like this, primitives like that, and draw contrasts. In fact, the overlap is enormous in terms of methods, aspirations, social constituency, and so on and so forth. Wesleyans, as one of my quotations imply, had a rather sticky attitude to the primitive thing came out of primitive. But by the 1870s, in some big cities, they were seeing the need for cooperation. In Leeds, for example, they actually held a joint efforts and they needed to combine things quite significantly in the 1870s onwards. However, there were, of course, still rivalries. In the 1870s, the Cambridge First Primitive Methodist Circuit and the Cambridge Second Primitive Methodist Circuit, they were the rivals in setting up rival chapels in the same village. So primitives were the most between their style, I think.
I think we're going to talk about always glimpse into 19th century